everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm so sad that I can't be with you in Colombia. It would be very fun to be in the actual country, and I've always wanted to visit. I'm so curious about all of the work that you all are doing, and just have a soft spot in my heart for the community that you're cultivating. So thank you so much for inviting me here today, and I hope I can get to be there in person next time. But I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about the future. I'm going to bring up some slides so that we can sort of walk through some ideas. Let's see here. All right, so I just wanted to help you all build a skill and talk a little bit about the idea of having this tool that we all need for ourselves, which is about envisioning the future. This practice of envisioning the future is something that we do at the International Living Future Institute every day. I'm very fortunate that I get to do that work. It's a lot of fun. In particular, what we charge ourselves with is envisioning the living future, and I'll tell you what we mean by that. And then showing that that future is possible to achieve both in practice and in policy. And I believe that this skill of envisioning the future and really understanding what it's going to look like is actually a skill that a lot of people who design and build buildings are really good at, because you're already people who are thinking about the idea that we're going to create something from nothing. You envision a building and then you make it happen. And so what I've found anyway in my career is that architects, engineers, people in construction are better than many people in the world at helping all of us to understand what it means to have a better future. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think that's so important. But I'll just introduce myself a bit first. I am not a person that builds or designs buildings. I'm an environmentalist by training, and I work with my colleagues at the Living Future Institute on climate solutions, but also on human health, on social justice issues. These are all sort of the frame of reference that I bring to the work. And it's what I've been doing since I was a kid. I've always been interested in the ways that we can make the world a better place. I was very lucky at a young age that I discovered and became really drawn to buildings, and the way that buildings sort of influence our lives and also can play a critical part in solving the problems that we face today. I think all know a little bit about the role that they play in climate change, although we'll talk about how we're doing there. But I just believe that buildings are one of the most exciting places to fight for a better world, to fight for climate justice, to fight for healthier communities, to fight for social justice, because buildings have these impacts on our lives in so many different ways. And so that's my chosen area that I engage in, even though I'm not someone that builds buildings. So I hope you'll understand that means I have a slightly different frame of reference than some of you may have. I don't show up to work every day and try to figure out how to do a better job of building buildings. I'm trying to figure out how is the building industry going to fundamentally change the world? So I hope that you'll go along that path with me a little bit and talk about how we can make that happen. And the good news is that we are changing the world right now. For many of us, this pursuit of green building and the movement of green building has been around for maybe 20, 30 years. Some of you will be newer to it, but this whole wave of activity has been going on for about 30 years, and it has fundamentally changed the building industry already. We are really proving that there is a better way to build and that it can impact people's lives in so many ways. I was very fortunate to get involved in LEED when it was first coming out. So I saw how LEED impacted the world. And then I saw how that manifested in a number of different environments. I worked with Google, I worked with WeWork, I worked for a tech company. And through all of these different lenses, I've gotten a better sense of what's working and what's not working in the green building community. And that's part of what I want to share with you all today, because we are all responsible for shifting this industry and shifting the world. And it's time, I think, for us to ask, how is that going? How are you doing? So the good news here, as I mentioned, is that we know what to do now. So these are just a handful of the amazing living buildings that we've been part of at the International Living Future Institute. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to be a living building in a minute. But one of the things that I think is so exciting is that there are examples all over the world now of what it means to be a building that is truly regenerative, that has a truly positive impact on the world. And it doesn't have to just be like a little house in, that is somebody's pet project in a easy climate that doesn't get particularly hot or particularly cold or humid or anything like that. We've got very extreme climates, and we've got these wonderful buildings that have proven that we can do more than just reduce the negative impact that we have on the world, that we can truly create positive impact on the world through the work that we do in building buildings. But the challenge today, and we're going to talk about this more, is that these are just examples. They're just a handful of buildings. And now we have to create a big shift in the work that we do collectively to make these kinds of buildings the standard for every building in the world. We're not just here to provide examples, to do one building at a time. We're here to change the way we build fundamentally. And so we have to now take these examples that show what is possible and turn that into policy, turn it into advocacy work, and fundamentally change how we build every building, not just these ones that have been able to go through the Living Building Challenge and pursue these really, what were seen as impossible goals before they did it. So that is my takeaway so far, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. I believe now is the time for us to take these buildings and show them to our policymakers, show them to our colleagues and friends, and show that this type of building is not only possible, it is the only path forward for our society, for our world, to create a place that is truly just, truly sustainable, and truly resilient against some of the challenges that we are going to face, especially climate-related weather disasters in the coming years. So I'm going to end this, just so you know, by asking you to get more involved in this movement. But I'll tell you a little bit more about why I think that is the challenge ahead, and what it's going to look like. So as a recap for those of you who might not have seen these numbers, although I'm guessing if you're at Construverde, you probably have seen some of these before. Buildings are still fundamentally emitting a huge amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So from an environmental perspective, they are a large part of the problem that we face with global climate change. This is from Architecture 2030. Hopefully you all are familiar with that organization. They do a great job of just keeping us honest and talking to us about what these numbers are. So we're a big part of the problem, which means we are a big part of the solution. Next slide's having a little trouble. Let's see. There we go. So also in 2040, 2/3 of the global building stock will be buildings that exist today. So we have to work on existing buildings at the same time that we have to be thinking about new buildings. We have to upgrade. We can't just focus on the new. And global building floor area is expected to double by the year 2060. So we are, in fact, talking about, so one of the things I think that's a stunning statistic, but is important to remember, is that despite all the work we've been doing to make buildings greener around the world, the amount of carbon that the building sector is emitting today into the atmosphere, it has not gone down. And the reason for that is because we continue to build more buildings. And a lot of the world, in particular, the developing world, is still building a lot more buildings. So those efficiencies that we've gained from, better building codes, green building standards, all of this voluntary work it's going to great use. It is definitely having an impact. And we've essentially flatlined. So we don't use a whole lot more energy and carbon emissions than we did 10 years ago as a global building industry. But we haven't gone down. And the challenge that the UN and the IPCC reports are giving us is that we as a building sector need to actually reduce our carbon footprint. So it's going to take a lot more than what we've just been doing so far. And that's why I say it's really going to take a pretty massive shift. We can't just get to where we need to be by being more efficient. We have to actually start to heal and to really get in there and improve existing buildings and to think at a different scale than the scale we've been thinking about. But again, the good news is we've had 20, 30 years of proving that it is possible for buildings to be built in a fundamentally different way. So now we just have to scale that. So I also want to make the point in terms of the problems that we're facing, that when we think about buildings and the impact they have on our lives, it's not just carbon. This is not just an issue of carbon emissions. I hope this is apparent to you all, but I really want to stress just how important it is for us to not focus only on carbon emissions. Certainly the coronavirus outbreak has given us all a better sense of how important our built environment is to our health. So if we don't fix problems of poor ventilation, if we don't fix problems of just basic housing and the crises that we face with people being unhoused, we won't be able to solve the problems that we face as a society today. The picture here on the right is of wildfires, which we are exposed to a lot here in California, where I live. So there are many issues that we're facing as a global society today that are exacerbated by buildings that aren't doing their part. And I don't think we will be able to overcome the challenges we face without really addressing fundamentally how we build buildings. So how do we do that? Oh, there we go. At the Living Future Institute, we really believe in this idea of not just reducing the negative environmental impact of a building, but genuinely pushing it to have positive regenerative impacts. And I think that for those of us who have not seen it before, we see it now in the past couple of years of the global pandemic, that there is a lot of suffering in the world. There is a lot that needs to be healed, and buildings can help to do that healing work. And in other words, when we think about the movement that we're a part of, we at the Living Future Institute don't believe that sustainable is enough, because sustainable really implies we keep our lives sort of the way they are now, or that we keep the ecological balance the way that it is now. We try to have a neutral impact. And I personally believe, and I think many of us do, that there's a lot more to be done than that. So we have to ask ourselves to go beyond. And I think it's fair for us, and there are many examples of how we can do this, to go beyond that and to really truly look at having a positive impact on the world. This is one of our guiding principles as a group at the Living Future Institute. It's the Buckminster Fuller quote: to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation, without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. It's just an inspirational point. I hope it inspires you. I think this is completely possible. I genuinely do. And the reason that I think that is because I see examples of it happening in communities every day. And so we are there to figure out, how do we take these examples of what works and what is truly good for the world and get them out into every community in the world and make it possible for everyone to build and to live this way. So I want to help tell that story and help convince you by telling you the story of one particular building, just so we can dive into the specifics a little bit of just how powerful it can be when you aspire to truly regenerative goals and work at it and get there. This is a building in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a soft spot for this building because I grew up in Atlanta. And for those of you who don't know Atlanta, it's a big city. It's humid. We get nice hot summers with a lot of humidity, and we sit out on our porches and drink lemonade and try to stay cool. There's a lot of sweat in Atlanta. And it's also a big city. It's very sprawling and full of highways and concrete. And it's, I remember growing up there, spending a lot of my time in the car. And not exactly what I wanted to be doing as a kid, but that was how I grew up. So this building recently opened just in the past few years. It's the Candida Building for Innovative Sustainable Design that's on the Georgia Tech campus in downtown Atlanta. So this is an urban site. The building was built on a site that had been a building before. And it's surrounded by, it's kind of a college campusy feel, but generally speaking, it's in the middle of a city. And I want to just point out that in terms of a building and what it can do, I think a lot of us have imagined, well, it's very easy to build a building that has all of this ecological health if you're in a suburban area or a rural area. And the team behind the Candida Building has really shown that it's possible in a city. So what you're seeing here is the rooftop. There's a beekeeper walking to take care of the bees, which they have that produce honey on the roof. You're also seeing someone picking blueberries on the roof. They have blueberry bushes and a number of other edible plants on the landscape. This building it's a pretty typical classroom building. There's a little bit of lab space in it and things like that, but it's otherwise a pretty normal building on a normal college campus. And yet, this building treats all of its own water. It collects rainwater off of those beautiful solar panels that you saw, treats it and uses it for potable water for drinking in the building. All of the toilets are composting toilets, so nothing goes into the sewer from this building. It is treating all of its waste. All of that compost material goes to fertilize landscapes nearby. And all of the stormwater is captured on site. Gray water is used. Everything, the whole building is completely circular in the way that it uses water, which is amazing in a climate like ours. Energy, the building uses about a third of the typical energy that a building like it in its climate zone would use. And it covers all of that energy with this beautiful solar panel roof, which, just to show you the picture before, they decided to use the solar panels as a shading device as well for the building. Because in our climate anyway, just being out of the sun is a pretty big deal. And so as a way of sort of duplicating or, taking care of two problems in one, they wanted to give this large sort of solar canopy as a way of keeping people shaded. And having been there on a hot summer day, I can tell you that the shade is very much appreciated. But what it also means is that these solar panels are taking care of 120% of the building's energy needs. So it is completely positive and net positive from an energy perspective. The material stories are some of my favorites always. So in this case, what you're seeing is some gentlemen who work with a program that is there in the community in Atlanta that helps to train folks who need job training, who are economically disadvantaged in some way, to learn construction skills and to learn fabrication skills that they can use to get better jobs and really attain more economic mobility in their lives. And this is all incentivized through the equity petal of the Living Building Challenge. So having a positive impact on people in their economic situation is a part of what we value and what we provide as a part of our standard. The material side of it as well, there are incredible things going on in this building. A lot of this wood, in fact, the wood that you're seeing this gentleman work with, my understanding is this was reclaimed. There's a lot of reclaimed materials from the site that they found thanks to this local nonprofit that they have that, I'll forget the name now. I think it's the Life Cycle Building Center in Atlanta. And they reclaim all sorts of different materials to allow people to then use them in building projects. So by this project team getting involved, they were able to take all of these materials that would have been left, a lot of them actually coming from the college campus that they had planned to throw away, and use them in the building in all sorts of different corners of the building. It's a beautiful thing. The textures are just amazing. The other thing I want to mention is that there was no waste in the construction process. Everything was recycled or it was used or it was reused. So nothing went to landfill from this building. And that, I think it's officially 99%, but in any case, they went to great efforts to make sure that the building really didn't, that the construction and design processes didn't produce any waste. On the health and happiness side, here you can see people enjoying the shade of those beautiful solar awnings there. There's a lot that the building did. If you're not familiar with our Red List program, living buildings are quite stringent in terms of what they require of materials that are used for the construction of the building. And we don't allow a pretty long list, our Red List of materials that are known to be harmful to human health. So this building has been built according to the Red List and has documented every single material that goes in there to make sure that it is not going to have a negative impact on these little kids playing cornhole there under the shade. Obviously, a lot has been done as well in terms of natural light and air. This is a radiant system that they use for heating and cooling, as well as the ceiling fans you can see, and a dedicated outdoor air system. The windows are operable, so people can come and go and get more fresh air when they need them. So it is a really beautiful space, and one that I think has been doing everything that they can do anyway to encourage health and happiness. You can see actually in another one of those pictures, I think, no, maybe it's this last one. Yeah, they have a beautiful stair as well. So helping people to use the stair is always a nice way to encourage healthy people. And then the last aspect is beauty. So if you hadn't caught on, these are the 7 petals of the Living Building Challenge. They're stringent and really look to address all the different aspects of how a building can contribute positively to its world. And our last petal is beauty. And when we say that, what we mean oftentimes is using aspects of biophilia, so natural materials and other things that sort of bring us closer to the planet, to our ecologies, but also the ways that we can use architecture to really delight people and to give them exposure to what it feels like to be in a truly regenerative building. So I think it's beautiful. I know there's always these debates about what that really means for a building, but we think that it's important to inspire people in that way. So this project, I just wanted to walk you through an example of what it can be like to impact the world in a truly positive way. If you think about the fact that the building is, it is providing nutrients to local ecosystems that are literally coming from the waste of the building. It produces more electricity than it consumes, so it's giving back more electrons of clean, renewable energy to the grid around it. It's creating jobs. It's helping to train people into new crafts and skills that they can use to develop their own career pathways. It's taking materials that otherwise would have gone to landfill and using them and giving them a second life. All of these things are positive impacts on the world. They're not just trying to reduce the negative. And this is possible in Atlanta. I truly believe that if it's possible in Atlanta, it's possible in many places. I'm not sure how much you know about the state of Georgia, but it's not always a politically safe place for projects like this. So it is certainly one where we have to consider that not everybody agrees that climate change is an issue in Atlanta. Not everybody agrees that toxic chemicals should be kept out of buildings. There's a lot that we still face that are political struggles, and we still manage to get buildings like this built. So I believe that we can and should be taking examples like this to show to the rest of the world. And here we go. And it's not the only building, as I mentioned. Some of my favorites are in very different climate zones. The one down here in the snow is in Colorado. And we have ones like the one in the bottom right is the PAE headquarters building. It's a nice looking building, but it's a pretty standard looking building. And it's still managing to do the same positive impacts as the ones that you see that clearly have a little bit more of an, eco vibe going on, I would say. So I genuinely believe that we don't have to ask this question anymore. Is it possible? I know many of you may be asking, is it expensive? Is it hard to build? I think that yes, absolutely. These buildings still can be very hard. It can be illegal in some places, and it can be expensive. I know that's sort of not a thing that people like me are supposed to say, but sometimes it does cost more. These days, especially with supply chains, global supply chains, the way they are, we definitely hear stories about how this is more expensive. So I don't want to shy away from that. And I guess I will say, as someone that's been in the green building world for 20 years, I'm kind of tired of always having to make it cost less, because at this point, I think it was for me the moment when wildfires really hit here in California, where I live now. And I started to realize we have to change. We have to make this the way that business works from here on out. We will make it as cheap as we can, and we're still working on that. But the challenge isn't so much to make it cheap. The challenge is survival. The challenge is, as Buckminster Fuller said, making life possible for 100% of humanity. And we're not doing that today. And so, yes, we will keep trying to make it cheaper. And I think you all do that work every day. But I want to encourage you all to not be afraid when you're talking to your stakeholders or your clients about why we do this work. We don't do this. We don't try to make these buildings the way they are because we think it'll save money. We do it because we're saving the world. We do it because we genuinely think that we're having a positive impact and that it's what the world needs. And the world does need that from the building industry. It absolutely needs us to have this impact. It needs us to play our part in addressing the crises that we face. That's our calling. It's my calling. I hope it's your calling as well. So that leads me a little into how we do that work. How do we go from these buildings that are possible to scalable buildings, taking this from the single examples to every building being built this way? And I will say I've been in my role at the Living Future Institute for only 9 months. Before then, I was doing a lot of different things, including working with tech companies in the sort of Silicon Valley style. And we think a lot about scale and what it is that makes it possible to scale an idea from just a few nerdy people who really believe in that thing to having it happen all over the world. And I'm very thankful for that time working in Silicon Valley, as tough as it was and as bizarre as it can be. I really got to experience the feeling of something becoming a household behavior, something becoming an object that we use every day, when before that wasn't the case. And you learn a lot, I think, from tech about what it means to change the world and how you go through those growing pains by doing that a couple of times. So I want to share a little bit about what I think we all have to do next to make that happen. in short, what I think we have to do is to focus on exponential impact. What are our levers for change that are going to take us from just building by building? We, convince one owner, we convince the next owner, we get some funding, we get some more funding, into the world where this just takes off. And I think we do that in a few different ways. This is a little graphic that I grabbed out of our new strategic plan. So Living Future Institute, we do, as many nonprofits do, a set of years of sort of charting our path for the coming years. And for us as an organization, this is where a lot of our focus is going to be in the next 3 years, is on building some of these new levers for exponential impact. I want to talk about a couple of them. Partnerships, we'll talk about a little bit, but advocacy, policy are big ones. And then this thing we call buildings as beacons. So we're starting to take buildings like the Candida Building and essentially working with people who work in those buildings to try to change their local communities. So as I mentioned, in Georgia, we face a lot of political and regulatory barriers to being able to build truly regenerative buildings. There are laws there that regulate the kind of wood we can use, essentially because of pushback from the forestry industry. So these things, we believe that by using an example of a specific building and showing people within the local community how that building was built, that we can truly change that local community. So we're going to be working with a select group of cities that have living buildings in them to really try to change city policy, local policy of different kinds. So planning and zoning and building codes and all of these things to make it possible for more people to build living buildings. On the policy front, there are a lot of organizations that work on really good policy change work. And so we're starting to work with them as well. But hopefully you all know people in your community that work on that. But the big one that I want to talk about for a minute is advocacy. And the advocacy side of it, at least here in the US, has been getting a lot of traction in the past couple of years. In the US, we have building codes that are established as sort of default building codes at the federal level. And those have been targeted essentially by oil and gas lobbying to essentially reduce the aspirations of building codes here in terms of their carbon footprint, specifically around things like on-site natural gas usage, et cetera. So we are trying to mobilize our community to start to show up and talk to our congresspeople and get involved in city councils, talk to our governors and other policymakers about why a different way of building is important. So a lot of our work now is really going into that aspect of advocacy. And what I have started to learn in my research on advocacy is that in order to do really good advocacy work, if you think about the kind of groups that do that in your community, it is oftentimes these nonprofit organizations that are really engaged in bringing people together and rallying against a cause. And I will say, I don't think that's really how we've always been in the green building world. We, the US Green Building Council, you all with the Green Building Council, they are like, all of us focus a little bit more on the private sector work. We focus on market transformation and trying to sort of, adjust what it means to be able to build a building in a green way. So we think about return on investment. We think about changing some of the dynamics of maybe a downtown district so that there's more peer pressure for Class A office buildings, for example, to go green. I think all of that is really meaningful, but also what I've come to understand in the past few years is that I think we might have been wrong in our theory of how we were going to change all the buildings. I think we imagined that by showing that it was possible in Class A office buildings and showing that it was possible in single family homes for maybe middle and high income folks, that it might become possible for low income folks, that it might become possible for public school buildings, that it might become possible for, mom and pop shops, as we call them, small commercial building owners that just have a little shop in a village. I don't think we ever really thought through that very much. And the actual possibility of low-income communities being able to afford the capital that it requires, it's just very far off. And I believe that is why we have to look to advocacy and policy. Essentially, we have to change the rules and regulations of buildings to make sure that it's no longer just an option to build healthy, green, impactful, positively impactful buildings, but that it is required by law. You can't build buildings that have toxic chemicals in them anymore. You shouldn't be able to build buildings that are burning fossil fuels on site. These are things that can absolutely be regulated. And that's the direction that we're heading now as an organization, is to really get more involved with policymakers to try to come up with policies that will genuinely direct resources where they need to be directed to ensure that everyone has access to regenerative buildings, and that those laws, essentially by putting them in place, will also come with the types of incentives and sort of economic structures that we need to make sure that everyone has access to buildings like this. So that's a little bit of why we're going in that direction. Another aspect of it that I believe is important, and this sort of gets to the partnerships point, is that we have this attitude that we won't be able to get to where we're going. We won't be able to get to the scale we need if we don't all partner together. And this is where I think for me, for a nonprofit organization, it means that we are going to partner with more nonprofit organizations, other people that are trying to pursue that beautiful future, the living future that we talk about and think about, that has these positive climate, health, and equity impacts for the world. For you, that might mean working more with your colleagues. A friend of mine started calling this Coopetation. So the word being putting cooperation and competition together. And he's an architect and believes that this idea should be that architects, even though we compete sometimes, or you compete sometimes, I should say, need to figure out ways to share ideas together and to push together to show the owner community, to the engineering community, to the construction community, to your subcontractors. If you have a unified voice together and you approach them together and say, we as architects all believe this is important. Yes, sure, you can compete in other ways at other times, but coming together is the only way you're going to be able to push your market as far as you need to. And so it's sort of a new evolution of this issue. I think we've been facing a little bit more and more in the green building community is how do we encourage the overall market to change and not just sort of fight for the small pieces of, the owners that are already really committed to green buildings. How do we actually increase the number by showing the world that we're all united on this? And then the last aspect of it, I don't know if you all are familiar with the dandelion, but it is part of our logo and metaphor of the Living Building Challenge and the work that we do at Living Future. And that is that it's our job to essentially disseminate ideas and to come up with ways that, these kinds of buildings or these types of policy changes can be implemented in specific communities, share those ideas, and then let them out into the world. And we have to figure out more mechanisms for that. But from a theoretical perspective anyway, that's what we aim to do at the Living Future Institute. We can't really be the change everywhere in the world, and we don't really want to try to say exactly how change should happen in every community around the world, because we don't think we know the answer. But we do believe that we can help seed some ideas about what it feels like to build truly wonderful buildings, the buildings of the future, to share those around with people in our communities like we are today, and to hope that they take that and plant that seed in their own community. So we will continue doing that. And we kind of think the metaphor of the dandelion is a beautiful one, because then another dandelion pops up and it has its own exponential impact. And that is oftentimes how big change happens. So I hope that this has given you a few little ideas about how it is that we can change how we see the world. It's a lot about just taking time and closing your eyes and trying to envision what it might feel like. Maybe it's what it might feel like for your neighborhood where you live, or the city that you live in. Imagine what it feels like when everyone has access to safe and healthy food, access to clean water. What does it look like? What does that city look like? What are its transportation infrastructures? What are the buildings like? How tall are they? What do people do for their jobs? How does that all work together as an economy? Maybe you read science fiction, maybe you don't, but I like to go to science fiction and sort of try to learn lessons from places like that, to imagine, okay, in a world that's in balance, where we aren't losing so many incredible different biological species every year, how would we pull that off? And you get into the nitty gritty, and then you take a step back, and I don't think it feels as impossible as it may seem. Maybe that's just me, but so far I think we've done a pretty good job of proving that it is possible. And so if you'd like to think more about that, if you'd like to get more involved in that work, or if you just like to get involved in trying to change policies or push for the change that you want to see in your local community, please join us. I'm going to wrap up so that you have this link here to check out our membership page, because we really believe that by cultivating a community of people who are thinking about these problems and who are trying to address them in their own communities, we can be stronger together. And that's our goal with our membership. We're going to be sort of revamping it and adding a bunch of new programming and opportunities this year. And I think it would be wonderful to have more folks from Colombia involved. But just generally speaking, we want to be there for you to facilitate community, to help you with whatever barriers you're facing in building truly regenerative buildings. And we hope the best for you. So thank you for your time. I hope this has been helpful. And I think we have maybe a few minutes for some questions. So let's see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Well, so I think we have some questions here. The first one is, how do you think we can start to talk about regenerative buildings in a developing country like Colombia?
Yeah, one of the things I love about working in developing countries is that there are barriers that you face that are different barriers. I want to recognize that. Like in my example in Atlanta, very different barriers that you face there than you would in a developing country. And yet some really interesting different opportunities. I've been really inspired recently by this year's Pritzker Prize winning architect, Francis Carré, who it works all over Africa and builds these buildings that are very much of the place. They're using materials that are local materials, craftspeople that are from oftentimes right near the site that he's building these buildings. And they're some of the most beautiful and celebrated buildings in the world, the Pritzker Prize. I mean, this was an incredible thing that he won that award. Similarly, here in the US, this past year, the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal Firm Award went to Mass Design Group, an incredible architecture firm that is based both in Africa and in the US, that also does really similar work in this way. So I guess one of the things I would say is, from the perspective of if I were working in the developing world, what I would be hoping to do and what I would be pretty excited about is thinking about how folks in your community built buildings before colonization or before the imposition of some of the sort of more international approaches to building, and figuring out how we can get people into great jobs building buildings with indigenous materials to the communities that you're in, so that by creating these new buildings in your communities, you're able to also save some of the traditional ways of building that we're sometimes losing. It's also typically better from a building systems, building science perspective, if you're using materials that are particularly good at addressing humidity, for example, for your climate. So there are all of these ways, I think, where in Atlanta, we don't have a lot of hope for being able to bring back some of the ways of building that existed, before colonization. But I do think in some parts, and I know there are, huge cities in Colombia, so I'm not really saying you would do this in a downtown area per se, but there are ways of really building back community and giving that sense of economic autonomy, sort of using the materials of the place, creating these independence and economic independence in jobs, more local businesses, right? Giving local entrepreneurs the opportunity to start these companies. So I think it's, in some ways, it's not easier. I wouldn't necessarily say that. It's different, but you have some really unique opportunities, I think, to help form really healthy and strong systems around you that I think we can't always do in a place like Atlanta, and that I hope you can find opportunities to engage with in your design work. So yeah, I guess that's one answer. I will say, I know that it's very different. I hope you all can have those conversations, and we want to know what the barriers are that you face that feel very different. But yeah, it's sort of, at least from my experience, there are things that are easier, there are things that are harder. Does that answer the question? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much. I think it was very inspiring. So I thank you for your conference, for all your inspiring words. And I think we're running out of time. So I thank you. And I hope we can meet in person sometime. Thank you.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.